The Woodstock Festival was over. The mud had dried, the crowds had gone home, and the sun was just coming up. But Jimi Hendrix was about to give a performance that would make the U.S. government watch him for the rest of his life. Only 200 people witnessed it live. It was Monday morning, August 18, 1969. The greatest music festival in history had just ended, or so everyone thought. For 3 days, nearly 400,000 people had packed into Max Yasgur's dairy farm in Bethel, New York. They'd seen Janis Joplin, The Who, Jefferson Airplane, and dozens of other legendary acts. But by Sunday night, most of them had already started the long journey home. They had jobs to get back to. School was starting. The portable toilets had stopped working 2 days ago. The food was running out, and everyone was covered in mud. As the sun set on Sunday, a mass exodus began. By midnight, the field that had held nearly 500,000 people was almost empty. But Jimi Hendrix was still there, waiting backstage. He was supposed to have closed the festival on Sunday night at midnight. That was the plan. Close out the biggest concert in rock and roll history with a bang, then disappear into legend. But nothing at Woodstock had gone according to plan. The festival had started late. Every act had run over their allotted time. Equipment kept breaking down in the rain and mud. By the time Sunday night rolled around, the schedule was a disaster. Jimmy's slot kept getting pushed back. Midnight became 2 a.m., then 4 a.m., then 6 a.m. His manager, Michael Jeffrey, was furious. "This is ridiculous," he kept saying. "You're the headliner, you're Jimi Hendrix, and you're going to play for nobody?" But Jimmy didn't seem to care. He sat backstage, tuning his white Fender Stratocaster, occasionally smoking, mostly just waiting. He'd been at Woodstock for the entire festival, watching the other acts, soaking in the atmosphere. Something about this place felt different to him. Something felt important. "Let them go," Jimmy said quietly when Jeffrey suggested canceling. "The people who are supposed to hear this will hear it." At 8:30 a.m. on Monday morning, as the sun broke through the clouds over upstate New York, Jimi Hendrix finally walked onto the stage. The massive crowd that had filled the field just hours before had shrunk to maybe 200 people. Most of them were crashed out in sleeping bags, too tired or too drugged to make the journey home yet. The stage crew was already starting to pack up equipment. The medical tents were closing down. The whole festival had the feeling of a party that had ended hours ago, where a few stragglers were still hanging around in the debris. Jimmy looked out at the tiny crowd and smiled. He was wearing a white leather jacket with beaded fringe, a red headband, and blue jeans. His afro was wild from 3 days of festival weather. He looked exhausted, but somehow at peace. "Good morning," he said into the microphone. His voice echoed across the nearly empty field. A few people stirred in their sleeping bags. "We just want to say hi to everybody and tell you to have a nice day and a safe journey home." Then he started playing. For the next 2 hours, Jimi Hendrix played what many consider to be the greatest live performance of his career. Not because of the crowd size, not because of the production value, but because of what he chose to do with the platform he'd been given. The first 45 minutes were incredible but relatively conventional. He played Fire, Red House, and Spanish Castle Magic. The tiny crowd was on their feet now, dancing in the morning sunshine. Word had spread through the remaining campers that Jimmy was actually playing, and people started emerging from tents and VW buses, drawn by the sound of his guitar. But then something shifted. Jimmy paused between songs, looking out at the growing crowd. In the distance, he could see the detritus of the festival. Abandoned tents, scattered garbage, makeshift peace signs planted in the mud. The Vietnam War was raging. The country was being torn apart. Young people were dying in Southeast Asian jungles while the government told them it was necessary for freedom. "I'd like to get something straight," Jimmy said into the microphone. His voice had changed now. it was quieter, more serious. "We're just jamming, that's all. We're just musicians, and we just want to get something straight with you guys. This is the national anthem we're gonna play. It's not unorthodox, it's just us." The crowd went silent. Even the people who'd been packing up their gear stopped to listen. Then Jimmy did something that would become one of the most iconic moments in rock and roll history. He played the Star-Spangled Banner. But he didn't play it the way anyone had ever heard it before. The opening notes were recognizable, the familiar melody that every American had heard thousands of times at baseball games and school assemblies. But almost immediately, Jimmy began to tear it apart and rebuild it into something entirely different. His guitar screamed and wailed. He used feedback, distortion, and the tremolo bar to create sounds that nobody knew a guitar could make. The melody would emerge from chaos, only to be swallowed again by what sounded like bombs falling, machine guns firing, people screaming. It was the sound of war, the sound of protest, the sound of America tearing itself apart. Some people in the crowd started crying. Others stood frozen, trying to process what they were hearing. This wasn't entertainment. This was art as confrontation. This was a black man, the grandson of slaves, taking the national anthem of the country that had oppressed his ancestors and was currently drafting young men to die in an unjust war, and transforming it into a protest song without saying a single word. The performance lasted about 3.5 minutes, but it felt timeless. When Jimmy finally let the last note fade into feedback and silence, nobody moved. Nobody clapped at first. They were stunned. Then slowly the applause began. Not the screaming and cheering that usually followed a great rock performance, but something more reverent. People were applauding the way they might applaud at the end of a powerful speech or a moving theater performance. Jimmy didn't acknowledge the applause. He just moved seamlessly into purple haze as if what he'd just done was perfectly normal. But the people who witnessed it that morning knew they'd seen something extraordinary. And unknown to Jimmy at the time, his performance was being captured on film. The footage would eventually be seen by millions, becoming one of the most iconic images of the 1960s counterculture. Within weeks of Woodstock, Jimmy's rendition of the national anthem was being discussed in newspapers across the country. Conservative politicians called it disrespectful and unpatriotic. They demanded radio stations refuse to play it. Some suggested Jimmy should be investigated for anti-American activities. The FBI, which had already been monitoring Jimmy because of his association with counterculture figures, intensified their surveillance. His phones were tapped. His concerts were attended by federal agents. They wanted to know if he was planning to use his music as a platform for political radicalism. But Jimmy always denied that his performance was political. When reporters asked him about it, he would shrug and say things like, "We play it the way the air is in America today. The air is slightly static, see?" Or, "I thought it was beautiful." The people who knew him best said that Jimmy wasn't making a political statement, at least not in the conventional sense. He was making a musical statement. He was showing what a guitar could do, what music could express, and how sound itself could carry meaning beyond words. But whether he intended it or not, his performance of the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock became a defining moment of protest music. It showed that you didn't need to write lyrics attacking the government or the war. You could take the government's own symbols and reinterpret them in a way that revealed uncomfortable truths. The 200 people who were there that morning knew they'd witnessed something special, but even they couldn't have predicted the lasting impact. That performance would be played at protests for decades to come. It would be studied in music classes and political science courses. It would be cited as one of the most important cultural moments of the 20th century. One of those 200 people was a young photographer named Elliot Landy. Years later, he described what it felt like to be there that morning. You could feel that something important was happening. Jimmy was channeling something bigger than himself. He was giving voice to what all of us were feeling but couldn't express. The frustration, the anger, the hope, the chaos of that moment in American history, it was all there in those 3.5 minutes. After Woodstock, Jimmy's life became increasingly complicated. The FBI surveillance intensified. Conservative groups protested his concerts. Radio stations that had previously played his music banned him. He was caught between two worlds: the establishment that saw him as a threat, and the counterculture that wanted him to be more explicitly political than he was comfortable being. "I'm a musician, not a politician," he told a reporter in 1970, less than a month before his death. "I just play what I feel. If people want to interpret that as political, that's their right. But I'm not trying to lead a revolution. I'm just trying to make good music." But the music he made that morning at Woodstock had already led a revolution, whether he intended to or not. It had shown an entire generation that art could be protest without being propaganda, that you could challenge authority without becoming an ideologue, that a guitar in the right hands could speak louder than any political speech. The irony is that almost nobody saw it happen live. The 200 people who stayed at Woodstock that Monday morning witnessed one of the most important performances in rock history, while the 400,000 who had been there the day before missed it entirely. Those who left early would spend the rest of their lives telling people they'd been at Woodstock, never knowing that the most iconic moment of the entire festival happened after they'd gone home. Jimi Hendrix died just over a year later, on September 18, 1970. He was only 27 years old. The circumstances of his death remain controversial. Officially an accident involving sleeping pills and alcohol, but with enough strange details that conspiracy theories persist to this day. But what's not controversial is the legacy he left behind. And at the center of that legacy is a 3.5-minute performance on a Monday morning in front of 200 people in a muddy field in upstate New York. Today, you can visit the site of the original Woodstock Festival. There's a monument there now, and a museum dedicated to preserving the history of those 3 days in August 1969. But the most powerful monument to what happened there isn't made of stone or bronze. It's made of sound. The sound of Jimi Hendrix's guitar, screaming and wailing and crying out against injustice in the only language it knew. The sound of the Star-Spangled Banner transformed from a patriotic hymn into a protest song without changing a single word. That's the real monument to Woodstock, not the massive crowds or the famous lineup or the cultural significance. It's the fact that one man with one guitar in front of 200 people could create a moment so powerful that it would still be reverberating through American culture more than 50 years later. The people who stayed that morning got to witness something that the people who left early missed. They got to see what happens when artistic genius meets historical moment. When someone has the courage to take a sacred symbol and ask uncomfortable questions about what it really means. They got to see Jimi Hendrix ask, through his guitar, what the American dream sounds like when you've been left out of it, what the national anthem sounds like when you don't quite feel like the nation is yours, what patriotism looks like when you love your country enough to demand it be better. And they got their answer. It sounds like feedback and distortion and beautiful chaos. It sounds like hope and pain and anger and love all mixed together. It sounds, as Jimmy said, like the air in America, slightly static. If this story of artistic courage and cultural revolution moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear about the power of using your gifts to speak truth. Have you ever witnessed a performance that changed how you saw the world? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like this video for more untold stories from music's greatest legends.